All right, now we're recording. So the question was about why we're using local storage. On basically any website, if you go into inspect, I'm revealing that I am a baseball enthusiast here. And if you go into your storage and you go to local storage or cookies are just like a really long string that gets used for services. So I have lots and lots of cookies that are being stored on my computer because they're only for my specific device so they can remember information about me. And then there's also local storage, which is just a lot of keys and values for things that I've selected that are relevant to my particular computer. I don't know what most of these are, but there's lots of them. Any other questions? Okay. No other burning questions, which is good. I noticed a bunch of people just recently joined. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to repost this link for the sign-in form in the chat. Please fill that out before you leave. Now that we're through with this, I am taking requests for anything that you guys would be interested in talking about, whether it be a review of this week's content for those of you who haven't looked at it yet, or a totally different topic. I know last week we had talked a little bit about um, trying to run a React app in the cloud, and we also mentioned potentially talking about TypeScript. And I got a request from someone a little earlier today that we could try and finish out the demo from last week, um, stuff like that. So anything you guys are curious about, feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll just go in order or whatever people prefer. Google sign-in. Um, that is a good question. And I don't think we're going to be able to really get into the details because it's a sort of complicated process and I barely understand it. But when you are on a website and you have the ability to log in using a bunch of different services, I'm trying to think if there's anything really good as an example. I think this counts on the CTD website. My advice to you. Yeah, I think this is an example that like when you have these buttons that say log in with GitHub, log in with Gmail, log in with Facebook, stuff like that. This is using a pattern called oauth, which allows you to authenticate using tokens. And you can authenticate through different services that you set up. So Google is one such service. The way that this generally works is there's like a portal that they have to go to, and it redirects them away from your website to go to the portal for the specific OAuth provider that they choose. So if they choose, I want to sign in with Google, it'll take them away to a Google portal where they can log in with your Google credentials. And then when you finish, I don't think it's going to do it here. No, it's not. I don't know how to demo this correctly, but what it'll do is it'll take you back to a redirect URL that you, the developer, can provide. And when the user's finished logging in through the portal, it'll redirect back to that URL, which takes you back into your website. But they specify extra parameters at the end of your URL. So it might look something like a token in the background and an auth token equals something else. And so it gives you in the parameters of the URL that it sends you back to of your website, it gives you the token that you will use in order to authenticate and send requests to that particular service. I think I butchered that explanation. It's a very complicated process that I wouldn't worry about a whole lot right now, but it's a pretty standard thing that you'll see in a lot of places. And if you're curious, maybe like a good YouTube video would be worth watching here. I wouldn't get into the nitty gritty and try and actually use this a whole lot. You probably need to create the component for yourself. In this case, I think this login with GitHub button is something that CTD has created, and it's just a link that takes you somewhere. I don't know if we're going to be able to see that in the console, unfortunately. I think we can just see that it's a button. Yeah, anyway, I think this is just a component that CTD has created on their page. And when I click it, it takes me to a specific URL. Maybe I can log out really quick. Try and see if we can see it. Nope. All right, it just has my credentials saved. All right, that's not a good demo, but that's generally how OAuth works and logging with Google. It's a good question. All right, anything else you guys curious about? Okay. The redirect isn't necessarily state. I'll just open up a Paint document really quick. Cool. So let's pretend that I have my application here, and these are my authentication providers for my service. So we'll say this one is GitHub, and this one is Google, and this one is Facebook, and then my app. So in this application, we define a page that's just like our login page, and inside that login page, we have a button, and the button is just to log in using something. So when I click that button, what's going to happen is I am going to send the user to a specific page that these different providers have all given me. So it's completely redirecting outside of your application. You have no control over it. And that page has information that you're giving it about who's trying to log in and stuff like that. And they will go ahead and do the login. And this will generate tokens. And so I get a token, which we're going to represent as a circle here. I think usually you get 2 tokens. So this token is going to be our authentication token. And then we're going to get another token called a refresh token. And then we're going to take these two, and our authentication provider is going to send them back to us. And so this is not in your application, and it's going to then send the user back into your application at a URL that you specify. So this is the URL of your app where you want the user to return. So when the user goes back into your app, where do you want them to be? You'll probably create like a component for this or a page for this or something like that. Or maybe you just send them back to the same page they were on. If they were on the home page, then you send them back to the home page. And what it's going to send them back to is your website. I hate that I just did your website with a UR, but it's too late now. Slash refresh token equals X. And I don't know what the name of the second parameter is, so we'll just call it auth is equal to YYY. Or rather, this is equal to our auth token that the provider generated for us, and this is our refresh token. And so your website can then extract from this URL that it's sending the user to these two tokens and store them in your local storage, presumably. And your auth token is how you will then authenticate to your server. So this token belongs to a specific GitHub user, and your backend somewhere is going to accept an authentication token that says, I am this user. And it can't be anyone else because you can only have an auth token that was given by GitHub that says, I am this user. And then a refresh token is what you would use when your authentication token expires. So tokens we set generally to expire after a certain period of time, usually a pretty low amount of time, so that if it's just sitting around for a while, someone can't pick up your computer and then immediately log in as you. Or no one can steal your token and then use it for themselves. Eventually, the token's going to expire and they're going to have to get a new one by logging in through GitHub, Google, or Facebook, which theoretically only you should be able to do. So your auth token will expire eventually after, I don't know, maybe 3 days, or in some cases like 1 day. And you'll use your refresh token, and you give your refresh token back to this provider, back to GitHub, and it'll regenerate you an auth token and a refresh token and give them back to you. And eventually your auth token will expire. And so then you give it your refresh token. You don't have to worry about what these providers do behind the scenes. You just have to worry about that flow of information. So things you'd be defining in your app are the buttons to log in with specific providers, that when you click them, they send you to a URL that's given to you by Google, Facebook, or GitHub. And you need to create like a page or some logic in your application that can read these parameters that it gives you back when it redirects back into your website. This might be anywhere. It could be your homepage, could be your dashboard, something like that. But some page that can read these tokens and store them locally. That's what you would be providing for this flow. I haven't used this a whole lot, so I very well may have explained something poorly. I think I've had to figure this out one time for a project that I worked on for a club in college, and it was one of the most confusing things that I've ever had to figure out. But once it kind of makes sense, it's a little easier to understand how it works, and the actual code that you have to write is not super scary. The burden of this implementation is on these providers on the back end, which you generally don't have to worry about. Yeah, storing the token, you just store in your local storage on your application. You don't have to, I mean, you can sometimes store tokens in your like a database for your application. It just depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Usually a token is a very short-lived thing that is just for your computer to say, this is who I am. And any other computer, you're going to get another token. And so in many cases, you can just store it locally on the computer because it's only the computer cares about it. And if it expires in one day, then it's not really important to like keep it in your backend so that you can get to it from any other computer for long periods of time, because you don't need it on other computers and you don't need it for long periods of time. In some cases, you might be interested in revoking a token early. Like maybe I have a token where it expires in 3 days, but my user logs out before the 3 days are up, in which case we don't want them to be able to log in using that token still. We want them to log in, which creates a new token, and then they use that token instead. And so in that case, you might store the tokens in your database and have some logic that says, revoke this token, it's no longer valid. Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty common thing as well. In that case, you might store them on the back end, but otherwise you can just store them in your local storage like a cookie. They will not get tracked on Git. Git is only for the code that you write on your computer. And once things are running, once your website is running, once your backend is running somewhere in the cloud, Git has nothing to do with it. So what is stored in local storage is some very obscure file on your computer in the program files for your browser. So it's stored in your browser knows how to interpret it. That's it. Other questions? Yeah, you're not like creating any tokens at the time of writing code. So it doesn't matter if you're writing code on your own or working in a group. The only place where tokens exist is when your application is running, and then Git is completely gone. You don't have to worry about like not committing things. Usually, maybe there's a case where you're creating a token and then storing it as a credential, like in a environment variable. But generally, we wouldn't do that with like a short-lived token from a provider like this. We would use that as like a password to authenticate. Cool. This is really complicated. I would love to talk about some stuff that's less complicated. Um, any other requests for things you guys are interested in? We could try talking about some other hooks that you don't talk about in this lesson. I know.
Hey,
Go ahead. Did someone?
yeah, I have one question, regarding Git conflict
Okay.
in my lesson 1.4.
Okay.
Yeah, you sent me a message, right? I just wanted to show you I saw all the conflict. So, yeah, shall I share my screen?
Yeah, if you want to.
So, 1 minute. Huh? So, this is your message.
Mm-hmm.
So, I resolved my conflict. So, look like branch committed.
Okay. I know the
So
button on the
git
bottom.
rebush and the git merge or git merge. I can do merge also, right?
Yeah, I
So
think you can do either one.
okay. So I will show you my now I don't have conflict.
That's okay. If you already solved it, then don't worry about it. I was just unsure.
No,
Uh,
just but I will just make sure like they all gone because it's showing the zero conflict.
all right. If it's showing 0, then you're probably good. I think on the front, when it was telling you you're one commit ahead, that also usually means that it's solved.
So in this file. So there is no conflict here, right? Or
I don't think you would know from this, since this is just looking at the code that exists in this file on your branch. I think if you scroll down in this pull request to the very bottom,
here pull request.
yeah, go back in there and then scroll down to the bottom and then click that button that says resolve. I didn't realize that it was
Or
going to give
resolve.
you a button to
Okay,
do it.
okay. There is
If
no
you
resolve.
go back into your lesson 1.4 for a second, your pull request, and then scroll down to the bottom. Okay, so it's
Here,
telling
here.
you that the branch has conflicts, so click that resolve conflicts button. What it means is you have in your main and your lesson 1.4 branches 2 different versions of this file. So if you look
Yeah,
at your lesson 1.4 branch, it's going to show you some code. And if you look in your main branch, it's going to show you other code.
yeah.
And
I just did it. I don't know how it didn't reflect the changes.
hmm,
So now two conflict again.
yeah, that looks okay. So I think there's a button in the top right that says mark as resolved.
Okay.
So why don't you go ahead and hit that? I think that indicates to Git that you're finished. Sorry, not that far up. Yeah, right there. Cool. So you fixed it for that one, and then we got to go into to-do list.
So mark as resolved. I didn't do that. That's why because I already resolved the conflict, but because of that.
Yeah, I think that probably was it. That's exactly the same. I don't know why it's telling you that's a conflict. That doesn't make any sense to me. Interesting.
Done.
Right. And then you can hit commit merge up in the top there. And that will go ahead and do it. Nice. All right. Looks good to me.
So I should do merge pull request.
Yes. And then you'll be good to start on lesson 1.5 after this.
Done.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you so
You're
much.
you're welcome. How to reset personal access token for GitHub. Yours is about to expire. Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and screen share, Jenny? And if you feel comfortable, I don't think there's anything that you'd be showing in your GitHub settings that would be scary. I'd be happy to do it if you don't feel comfortable, but otherwise we can walk through it as a group. Yeah, okay. Let's do that. So in your GitHub, you'll have to go into your personal access token settings, which is GitHub, and then click on your profile and then settings and passwords and authentication. Maybe? Um, Two-factor authentication, passkeys. Yeah, I feel like this has got to be it. Maybe not. Okay, I think you can go into settings and then down at the bottom, there's developer settings. And when you click on developer settings, it'll show you personal access tokens. And then from there, you can create a new one or revoke them. So if yours is about to expire, you'll just want to create another one and then use that instead when you're using Git from your command line. You might have to set the new password to be that token, which I think you can Google, and Stack Overflow will show you how to do that. Yeah, I think generally what people do is use like the credential helper, sorry, credential manager, or global config. I don't remember exactly what it is, but there's some way that you can save your personal access token as your password, and then you save your username, and that way when you get pushed, you don't have to put it in every time. And so you'll just want to update your password in wherever it's currently saved, which I think is credential helper. I think credential manager is something else. Yeah, your credential helpers, you should be able to just set the password to be your new personal access token and then go from there. Maybe this would be good documentation. All right, other questions? Truly, I don't know the difference. I've never used a fine-grained personal access token yet, so I don't know that I can help you on this. I still just use classic access tokens.
If you could explain a little bit about week 5 assignment.
The 1.5 assignment?
Yes.
Sure, we can talk about it.
Thank you.
So let's pull it up here for a second. All right, so this week the content is learning about how to do side effects with the UseEffect hook and creating custom hooks. Also talks about fragments, which is not anything particularly exciting, and so I don't think you even use oh, no, you do use a fragment, but it's just like an afterthought. The main difficulty of this assignment is that you want to be able to persist your to-do list for when the page refreshes. So if I go into my to-do list application, I should be able to add a bunch of to-dos, and then when I refresh the page, or if I close it and come back to it, or if I stop my V server that's running in my console and start it back up again, I should be able to get back to the same to-do list that I had previously. So normally we can't do that because React has state for an individual component, but as soon as that component goes away, whether it be the page refreshes or the server ends or something like that, we lose everything. So part of this assignment is using your local storage, which is what we were talking about a little bit earlier. It's a very simple API. You just write local storage, get item, set item, and then you'll be writing some logic to get from local storage and set to local storage when you added it to do, and save the whole list there. So you'll definitely be using UseEffect, and you'll be using a custom hook that you write. So we could talk maybe really quickly about UseEffects, just as a refresher for anyone, or if you haven't gotten there yet, we can talk about what those are. UseEffect is extremely, extremely useful. If I have an application, what are we gonna use as our demo here? All right, we'll come up with an example later, and we'll just talk about what it is first. So UseEffect is another hook. Hooks are anything that starts with use. And what we mean by hook is you are executing code at a specific lifecycle event of your React component. So your use state hook executes when your function is called and your component re-renders in order to persist state between renders. And your UseEffect hook executes when your component re-renders, but more specifically, when specific pieces of state inside of your component have changed. So if I have, let's say I have an input here. This is not a great example, but we're gonna just go for it anyway. So let's say I have an input value is equal to first name, and I have an input value is equal to last name. And I want to create a controlled component, which means the value inside of my inputs are controlled by a state variable. And when that value changes, our state needs to get updated. So I would have state variables for first name, set first name, equal to use state, empty string as our default, and our last name, set last name, equal to use state, another empty string. And I gotta import this. Cool. So if I have a controlled component, I need to set the value of my input to be whatever is currently in the state. And then on change, we execute a function, and that function is going to take a parameter, which is the change event. And we're going to set first name to be e.target.value, which is the easiest way to get the value of an input. And I don't actually like this being on its own line since it's only one piece of code. And so I'm going to stick it in a one-liner here. And I'll just copy this and do this with our last name here. Cool. So let's say when our first or our last name changes, we want to execute some piece of code. If you have something that you want to run when a piece of state changes, or at the very beginning, when your component is rendered for the first time, you would use a UseEffect. And a UseEffect is a function. You give a reference to a function as the first argument, and an array is the second argument. And the function is what's going to run, and your array is all the pieces of state that you want to watch. And when any of those change, rerun this code. So I'm going to specify UseEffect here instead of executing a function and say when my first name or my last name changes, I want to do something here. Let's pick a stupid example and say I want to count the number of let's count the number of letters in the entire name, our first name and our last name. So let's put a paragraph down here at the bottom that says, actually, let's not do this. Let's start simple. So I'm going to say, let total length equal to first name dot length plus last name dot length. And this is going to run, and we're going to console.log total length. Cool. And let's run this app in our browser and hope that it works. Come on. I know you can do it. There we go. All right, so this is our first name blank and our last name blank right afterwards. If I go into my console, zoom in the console for you guys. When I type in this box, it should, every time I change anything in this value, it's going to trigger that UseEffect that's going to rerun the code. We'll split screen this just so you can see what's going on. Cool. And so it's going to execute that code. This is a very silly example that is not particularly useful. One thing we could do to make this feel a little bit more useful is we could do some interesting like algorithmic thing. Like we could count the number of A's in the string. In this case, we would get 1, 2, 2 letter A's. Is that like super useful? Let's do it just for fun. Oops. Cool. All right. So right now there are 0. Should set our default to be 0. And then we could do that in the UseEffect, which we'll do in a second. Let me read this question first. When the to-do list changes, like adding a new task, UseEffect will run the code inside the function. Yes. What you'll be doing for this assignment is using a UseEffect in order to watch for when a new to-do is added to the to-do list. So when we change our to-do list, you'll be using a UseEffect where the thing you're watching is the to-do list itself. And inside, this is where you would want to save it to local storage. When that changes, I want to save the new version to local storage and overwrite what was already there. So if I add or delete lists or items in the list, then it gets saved to your local storage. And that's what you'll be doing for this assignment. And you'll be writing a custom hook to extract some of that logic outside of this function. Great. We like that. All right, let's go back to this ridiculous example here. So let's do this. Let number counts equal to 0 for I. Let I is equal to 0. I is less than. Actually, let's also stick them together here. Less than name.length. So iterate from start to finish. Let's get name dot char at I, which gives us a single character at index I. And if this is equal to a or name.char I is equal to a, then count plus plus. And at the very end, we will return, no, we'll set number of A's be count. Cool. The name, there's name. Cool. And so if we go back into our website and refresh it really quick, the name, let's put some quotes around here. Do I have to escape this or what's the deal? It doesn't like using quotes, but it seems to be working, so I'm gonna leave it. All right, well, if we change the name in here, Elijah Smith, McDonald, every time we put another A in here, it's going to update our count because it reran our UseEffect code. Very, very useful. You'll be using this a lot. Generally, in a UseEffect, anytime you have a piece of state that you reference inside of the UseEffect, you probably want it to be in this array at the end, which is called a dependency array. The things you depend on for when it's going to rerun. That's not always the case. React will very often tell you, well, you're using a state variable in here, but you didn't put it in your dependency array. So what the hell are you doing? And I think there are many cases where it is intentional to not put it in there. So don't listen to React all the time when it comes to UseEffects and dependencies. Think about it, make sure that it makes sense in your head, all the things that are in your array that you're watching, and don't just make the yellow squiggle go away. Very often, I will tell it to ignore this line because I know that I'm right and it's doing what I want, even though it's telling me I need to put some other stuff in there that I don't need. So that's useful. We can also use a UseEffect where the dependency array is empty. And this will execute one time when your component first renders and never again. So if I refresh my page, it's going to print first because it renders when our component is first being put onto the screen. And no matter how many times it re-renders when I do other things, every time I type in here, it's re-rendering this component. It is not going to print first again. So this is useful if you have some initialization logic that you need to execute. Maybe you need to go and get some data from somewhere to be used in the page. Or maybe you're setting up some sort of subscription, or setting up a connection to somewhere that's feeding you data. You'll use a UseEffect to go and get that data when your component first renders, or to set up that connection so you can listen. A pattern that is common when you're subscribing to a data source, like maybe something that happens is you're connecting a WebSocket. A socket is one way of communicating between your front end server, your website, and a backend somewhere. In addition to actual like web HTTP requests using fetch, which we'll do in a couple weeks, so don't worry about it. But sockets allow you to communicate in real time. So I can send data and my server immediately gets it, acts on it, and then decides whether to send me stuff back. And you can set up a connection and then listen for specific events. So if my client broadcasts an event with the name foo, and my server is listening to the event foo, the server will react to the event. And anything it's not reacting to, it doesn't care about, and it'll ignore. So what happens is when your page renders that needs to create that connection, we socket.new blah, blah, blah. We create a new socket connection, and we store that locally. And then we can listen for a specific event. And if we get that, then we'll execute a function. This is not valid code, by the way. This is just pseudocode. And so what this does is it creates our new socket connection, and it listens for these events, which will happen for the duration of the time that your component is on screen. And you only want to do this when the component is first rendered. You don't want to do this every time it re-renders, because then you're just recreating stuff over and over. And one other cool thing you can do with UseEffect is you can specify a function. You can return a function that gets called when your component leaves the screen. So this UseEffect executes when your component enters the screen for the first time. And then when your component leaves the screen, it will call this function that you return. And here's where you clean stuff up. So a socket connection is resources that you have to store in your browser, and it's work that your browser needs to do. And also you need to let the server know that this connection is finished and the client is gone. The server doesn't know that you went to a different page on your website unless you tell it. And so you close your socket connection to clean up anything locally, and also to tell the server, I'm done, you can stop listening to me. And so we want to execute this when the component leaves, once we're done with our socket, and so we would put it in this return statement. This is generally only something you use if you have a connection that you need to clean up. Outside of like connections, I don't know that I've seen this used anywhere personally, but I'm sure there are uses. If you guys are curious about sockets, there's a socket.io library that exists in a lot of different languages. This is the one that I've most commonly seen with JavaScript. Again, not something you should worry about implementing right now, especially since we don't actually have a backend to connect it to. Sockets are only useful if you're running like a server somewhere, and you also have a front end that needs to connect to each other, which we don't have. So this would just be some reading if you're interested in learning about sockets and how they work. But this is generally the pattern you would use. One other thing really quick. Sometimes you might write a UseEffect and in this UseEffect, you specify no dependency array. So let's say I just completely forgot to put a dependency array in here. And I'm going to console.log oopsies to indicate that we did something wrong. I'm going to get rid of this code, which is no longer valid. And all right, I'm going to mute just for a second. So this UseEffect does not have a dependency array. And if I run my application, it's going to print oopsie when it initially loads, and it's going to print oopsie every time that my page re-renders, which is not what we want. It's not listening to specific events changing and running the code. It's not executing the very first time. It's executing every single time. This is a bug. You should never do this on purpose. I've done it on accident many times. Something to be aware of. Okay, that's everything that I think is important to know about UseEffects. And you'll be doing that as part of your assignment this week. Any questions about UseEffects or hooks in general, or anything else that we just talked about?
Thank you so much for explaining. I learned a lot today.
Great, I'm glad. Okay, if there's no questions, I'm gonna call it here. I don't have anything to talk about for 4 minutes. If you have any questions that you want to ask and you want to do it in front of the group, feel free to stick on. Otherwise, I will see you guys next week on Thursday as usual. Have a good weekend. Have a good spring break. If any of you guys have spring break or are taking time off, go somewhere cool.
Have a good weekend. Thank you. Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.